2GB VRAM. This is where gaming GPUs existed a decade ago, and where they struggle to survive today. Cards like the old GT 1030 and ancient GTX 750 came with 2GB, and back in 2014, that wasn't a disaster. You could run League of Legends, Counter-Strike, and lighter titles without your screen turning into a blurry mess. Today, it's borderline unusable. Modern game engines assume you have way more memory than this. When you boot up a 2024 or 2025 title with 2GB VRAM, textures refuse to load properly. You'll see low-resolution placeholder graphics, constant stuttering as the GPU desperately swaps data in and out, and frame drops that make gaming feel more like watching a broken GIF. Even esports titles that are supposed to run on anything will complain. Valorant might technically boot, but you'll be playing on the absolute lowest settings with textures that look like they belong in a mobile game from 2012. The GPU itself might be capable of rendering frames, but without enough memory to store the visual data, performance falls off a cliff. If you're looking at a GPU with 2GB VRAM in 2026, you're essentially looking at electronic waste. It won't game, it won't edit, and it barely functions for anything beyond displaying your desktop. This tier exists purely as a reminder of how far we've come. 4GB VRAM. Around 2018 to 2019, 4GB felt like the sweet spot for budget gaming. Cards like the GTX 1650 and RX 5500 XT shipped with this amount, and they handled 1080p gaming reasonably well. You could play Fortnite, Overwatch, and older AAA titles on medium settings without major issues, but modern games have moved on aggressively. Today's AAA titles are built with high-resolution textures that assume you have significantly more VRAM. When you try running something like Starfield or Hogwarts Legacy on a 4GB card, the game will technically launch, but you'll immediately hit a wall. Textures get downgraded automatically, and you'll see constant pop-in where objects suddenly appear in front of you because the GPU couldn't load them in time. At 1080p on medium settings, you can still squeeze playable performance out of esports titles like CS2 or Apex Legends. But anything recent that demands high-quality assets, you're going to struggle. The GPU might have enough processing power to hit decent frame rates, but the moment you try enabling higher texture quality or increasing draw distance, everything collapses. In 2026, 4GB is the absolute floor for gaming, and even then, you're compromising heavily. It's fine for older games or lightweight competitive titles, but if you're planning to play anything released in the last 2 years, you'll spend more time adjusting graphics settings than actually enjoying the game. Quick question, how much VRAM does your GPU have? Drop it in the comments. 6GB VRAM. Between 2018 and 2020, 6GB was the king of 1080p gaming. The RTX 2060, GTX 1066GB, and RX 5600 XT all came with this amount, and they crushed it. You could max out settings in most games at 1080p, dabble in 1440p gaming on medium settings, and never worry about running out of memory. The problem is games evolved faster than anyone expected. By 2023, developers started designing games assuming players had 8GB or more. Titles like Resident Evil 4 Remake will run on 6GB, but you'll notice texture quality drops and occasional hitching when the GPU runs out of space. At 1080p, you're still mostly fine if you stick to high instead of ultra settings, but the real killer is modern features. Ray tracing, completely off the table. Frame generation technologies like DLSS or FSR, those add extra memory overhead, and 6GB just can't handle it. If you own a 6GB card today, it's still usable, but you're living on borrowed time. It went from being the perfect amount to feeling cramped incredibly fast. 8GB VRAM. This is where things get controversial. Cards like the RTX 3070, RTX 4060, and RX 6600 XT all ship with 8GB, and the debate over whether that's enough has never stopped. For 1080p gaming, 8GB handles almost everything smoothly. You can max out settings in most games, enable ray tracing in lighter titles, and keep background apps running without issues. The problem shows up at 1440p, especially in newer AAA games. Titles like Call of Duty or Alan Wake 2 will push past 8GB at ultra settings, forcing you to drop texture quality or deal with stuttering. And 4K? Forget it unless you're fine with medium textures and compromised visuals. The GPU itself might have the horsepower to run these games, but the memory bottleneck kills performance. What makes this frustrating is that many 8GB cards are genuinely powerful. The RTX 3070 can handle 1440p gaming beautifully, but in certain scenarios, it runs out of VRAM before it runs out of processing power. That's a design choice that angered a lot of people, especially since competing AMD cards at similar prices often came with 12GB or more. Still, for most gamers playing at 1080p or 1440p without maxing every setting, 8GB works. It's not future-proof, and you'll need to be mindful of texture settings in demanding games, but it's functional. Just don't expect it to age gracefully. 12GB VRAM. This is where modern gaming finally feels comfortable. Cards like the RTX 4070, RTX 3060, and RX 6700 XT all ship with 12GB, and this tier hits the sweet spot for most gamers. At 1080p, you're massively overkill. At 1440p, you can max out every setting without worry. At 4K, you can comfortably run high settings in almost every game. Modern AAA titles are starting to recommend 12GB for ultra textures and ray tracing. Games like Hogwarts Legacy and Starfield explicitly list 12GB as the target for optimal visuals. This tier also gives you breathing room for content creation. Video editing at 1080p or 1440p. Photo editing with large files and light 3D rendering all run smoothly. You're not maxing out memory constantly, and multitasking while gaming becomes effortless. For anyone building or upgrading a gaming PC in 2026, 12GB is the recommendation. It's not overkill, but it's more than enough for the next few years. Even as games continue demanding more memory, 12GB will handle it without forcing you to compromise on visual quality. 16GB VRAM. This is where gaming meets professional workflows. Cards like the RTX 4060 Ti 16GB, RX 7800 XT, and RTX 4070 Ti Super come with this amount, and suddenly limitations disappear. At 4K Ultra settings with ray tracing enabled, everything runs smoothly. Heavy texture packs, high-resolution mods, and demanding visual features don't even make the GPU flinch. But the real advantage is for creators. Editing 4K video timelines and running Blender with complex 3D scenes all benefit from having this much memory. You're no longer thinking about whether your GPU can handle something, it just does. For gamers who also stream or record their gameplay, 16GB removes any worry about multitasking. Running OBS, Discord, a browser with dozens of tabs, and a demanding game simultaneously, no problem. The VRAM can handle all of it without performance dropping. If you're planning to keep your GPU for 5+ years or you do any kind of creative work alongside gaming, 16GB is the smart choice. It's more expensive upfront, but you're buying longevity and flexibility that 8GB or 12GB cards simply can't match. 24GB VRAM. Cards like the RTX 4090, RTX 3090, and RTX 3090 Ti come with 24GB, and at this point, you're not just gaming, you're rendering, creating, and pushing professional workflows. Every game at 4K Ultra with ray tracing maxed runs flawlessly, but more importantly, creative work thrives. Video editors working with 8K footage or heavy effects no longer worry about memory limits. 3D artists rendering massive scenes in Blender or Unreal Engine can work without constant crashes or slowdowns. For pure gaming, 24GB is overkill. But if you're a content creator, streamer, or professional who uses their GPU as a primary work tool, this tier makes sense. You stop thinking about what's possible and just work. Projects don't slow down, apps don't crash, everything just runs. This is also the tier where your GPU becomes a long-term investment. While 8GB cards are already feeling pressure, 24GB will remain relevant for years. 48GB VRAM. Cards like the RTX 6000 Ada with 48GB exist in a completely different world. These aren't gaming cards. They're professional workstation GPUs designed for studios, research labs, and enterprise environments where downtime costs thousands of dollars per hour. At this level, you're working with Hollywood-level VFX, massive scientific simulations, training large AI models, and running enterprise rendering farms. The RTX 6000 Ada comes with 18,176 CUDA cores, 568 tensor cores, and error-correcting memory to ensure absolute stability. These cards cost over $7,000 and they're worth every penny in professional environments. For gaming, this does absolutely nothing extra. Your games won't look better. Your frame rates won't magically double. Your loading times won't improve. For 99% of people, this much VRAM is complete overkill. But in professional settings where render times translate directly to revenue, where crashes halt entire production pipelines, and where massive datasets need to fit entirely in memory, 48 gigabytes makes perfect sense. If you're considering this tier and you don't already know exactly why you need it, you definitely don't.